In the final days of March 1603, England's most powerful woman sat motionless in the dim chambers of Richmond Palace, wrapped in silence, shadow, and dread. Queen Elizabeth I, the monarch who had ruled for nearly 45 years, who had defied assassination plots, foreign invasion, religious civil war, and betrayal from within her own blood, was now being consumed by something no army could repel. Time itself had turned against her. By March 19, 1603, the Queen had stopped eating. By March 20, she refused to lie down. By March 22, she was barely speaking. On March 24, shortly before dawn, Elizabeth Tudor died, ending one of the most consequential reigns in European history. But the truth of her final days was far more terrifying than the polished legend history later constructed. This was not a peaceful passing of a satisfied ruler drifting gently into rest. It was a prolonged psychological and physical collapse marked by paranoia, grief, isolation, and an overwhelming fear of extinction. The woman who had once commanded fleets and humbled empires now sat frozen on cushions for hours at a time, refusing comfort, refusing medicine, refusing the very act of sleep, as if lying down itself were a surrender to death. Elizabeth was 69 years old, an advanced age by the standards of the early 17th century, yet her decline was sudden and alarming. Only months earlier, she had still appeared in public, her white, painted face and red wig masking the toll of age. But beneath the cosmetics, her body was failing. Her teeth were blackened. Her skin was ulcerated. Her joints were inflamed. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, had grown thin and strained. And most dangerously of all, her mind was weighed down by decades of trauma, betrayal, and unresolved fear. To understand why Elizabeth's final days were so harrowing, one must first understand the psychological burden she carried. She was not simply a queen approaching death. She was the last of her line, the final Tudor, the daughter of a beheaded mother and a tyrannical father. From the age of 2, she had lived with the knowledge that royal blood offered no protection from the executioner's blade. She had watched her stepmothers die, disappear, or fade into irrelevance. She had been imprisoned in the Tower of London as a young woman, uncertain if she would emerge alive. Power for Elizabeth was never secure. Survival was always conditional. That fear never left her. Even at the height of her reign, Elizabeth trusted few and suspected many. The executions of Mary, Queen of Scots in 1587, and the crushing of the Babington plot had saved her throne, but at a cost. Ordering the death of a fellow anointed monarch weighed heavily on her conscience. In her final years, Elizabeth reportedly spoke of Mary's execution with visible distress, claiming she had never truly intended it, though the historical record makes clear she authorized the warrant. Whether guilt or political theatre, the memory haunted her. By the late 1590s, England was exhausted. War with Spain dragged on. Rebellions in Ireland bled men and money. The economy strained under inflation and poor harvests. Elizabeth's court, once vibrant and dazzling, had become a place of anxiety and intrigue. Many of her closest companions were dead. Sir Francis Walsingham, her spymaster, had died in 1590. Sir Christopher Hatton was gone. Sir Francis Drake had died in 1596. Most devastating of all was the execution of Robert de Vereux, the Earl of Essex, in 1601. Essex had been Elizabeth's favourite, perhaps even the closest thing she allowed to love. He was reckless, arrogant, and politically disastrous, yet she tolerated him longer than reason allowed. When he led a failed rebellion against her authority, she was forced to choose between mercy and survival. She chose survival. Essex was executed for treason, and Elizabeth never recovered. Contemporary observers noted that after his death, the Queen fell into deep melancholy. She withdrew from courtly life, refused music, and avoided conversation. It was said that she sat for hours staring at the floor, lost in thought, unmoving. This emotional collapse accelerated her physical decline. In the winter of 1602 to 1603, Elizabeth's health deteriorated rapidly. She suffered from recurring fevers, weakness, and swelling, likely symptoms of blood poisoning, cancer, or a combination of chronic infections exacerbated by age. Her doctors, limited by the medical knowledge of the time, prescribed traditional remedies such as purging, bloodletting, and herbal concoctions. Elizabeth, increasingly distrustful, refused many treatments. She believed, perhaps rightly, that they would hasten her end rather than prevent it. One of the most disturbing aspects of her final days was her refusal to lie down. For days at a time, Elizabeth remained upright, supported by piles of cushions and stools. Courtiers begged her to rest in bed. She refused. Some believed she feared suffocation. Others believed she associated lying down with death itself. In Tudor England, deathbeds were ritualized spaces, where confession, inheritance, and final words were given. Elizabeth may have believed that lying down would signal her acceptance of death, something she could not psychologically allow. As her condition worsened, the question of succession became unavoidable. Elizabeth had never married. She had no children. For decades, she had refused to name an heir, believing that doing so would invite plots and weaken her authority. But now England stood on the brink of a potential power vacuum. Civil war was a real possibility. Foreign powers watched closely. The leading candidate was James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the very woman Elizabeth had executed. The irony was cruel and inescapable. In her final days, Elizabeth was pressured to confirm James as her successor. According to multiple contemporary accounts, including those of Sir Robert Cecil, she finally gave a sign. Too weak to speak clearly, she reportedly gestured toward James when asked whom she wished to succeed her. It was not a triumphant declaration. It was a silent surrender. The Tudor dynasty would end with her breath. By March 23, Elizabeth was drifting in and out of consciousness. Her once sharp mind was clouded. She murmured fragmented phrases, some religious, some reflective. Those present described a haunting stillness broken only by labored breathing. The Queen, who had once electrified Parliament with her speeches, now struggled to form words. The courtiers around her, trained in obedience and restraint, watched helplessly as the symbol of England itself faded before them. In the early hours of March 24, 1603, between 2 and 3 in the morning, Elizabeth I died. There was no dramatic final proclamation, no grand speech, no public farewell, just silence. Within hours, messengers were dispatched north. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns and beginning a new chapter in British history. Yet, behind the official proclamations and blacked, draped ceremonies lay a darker truth. Elizabeth's death was not merely the passing of a monarch. It was the end of an era shaped by fear, survival, and relentless control. Her final days stripped away the myth of the Virgin Queen and revealed a deeply human figure, terrified of death, haunted by memory, and unwilling to let go of power even as it slipped from her grasp. This terror, this refusal to surrender, would shape how she was remembered and how England transitioned into a new age. And the consequences of her final days would echo far beyond the walls of Richmond Palace. To fully understand why Elizabeth I's final days descended into such terror, one must look backward across the long psychological road that led her there. Elizabeth did not simply fear death because she was old or ill. She feared it because death had stalked her since infancy, wearing familiar faces and striking without mercy. Her entire reign was built on the instinct to survive, and when survival was no longer possible, the collapse was devastating. Elizabeth Tudor was born on September 7, 1533, into danger. She was the daughter of King Henry Roman VIII and Anne Boleyn, a marriage already mired in scandal and political hostility. By the age of 2, her mother was arrested, accused of adultery, incest, and treason. Anne Boleyn was beheaded on May 19, 1536. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, stripped of her royal status, and removed from the line of succession. This was her first lesson in power. Blood meant nothing without favour, and favour could vanish overnight. As a child, Elizabeth learned to observe rather than trust. She watched her father marry again and again, each wife rising or falling based on Henry's whims. Catherine Howard, another stepmother, was executed when Elizabeth was 8 years old. Jane Seymour died in childbirth. Catherine Parr survived but narrowly escaped to rest herself. These events carved a permanent truth into Elizabeth's mind. Queens could die. Princesses could be discarded. Safety was an illusion. Her danger intensified after Henry's death in 1547. Under the reign of her half-brother Edward VI, Elizabeth became entangled in scandal when Thomas Seymour, the ambitious husband of Catherine Parr, began behaving inappropriately toward her. Though Elizabeth escaped formal punishment, the episode reinforced her understanding that proximity to power attracted predators, and that innocence offered no protection. The greatest trauma came during the reign of her half-sister, Mary I. When Mary ascended the throne in 1553, England was thrown back into Catholic rule. Elizabeth, a Protestant symbol, whether she wished to be or not, became a focal point for rebellion. In 1554, after Wyatt's rebellion, Elizabeth was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. She entered through Traitor's Gate, the same entrance her mother had passed through before her execution. For weeks, Elizabeth believed she would die. She wrote letters begging for mercy, insisting on her innocence, fully aware that truth mattered less than politics. She survived, but she never forgot. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, she carried the Tower with her, not as a building, but as a state of mind. She ruled cautiously, suspiciously, always alert to betrayal. Every Catholic plot, every foreign marriage proposal, every rebellious noble reinforced her belief that her life was perpetually at risk. This fear shaped her most famous decision, never to marry. Historians often romanticize Elizabeth's virginity as a symbol of independence or political genius. In reality, marriage represented danger, marriage meant surrendering control, marriage meant producing heirs who could replace her, marriage meant trusting someone with her body, her authority, and her survival. She had seen what husbands did to queens. She had seen how succession bred violence. She chose solitude because solitude was safer, yet solitude carried its own cost. Elizabeth surrounded herself with courtiers, favorites, and advisers, but intimacy was always conditional. Men like Robert Dudley and later Robert Devereux were allowed closeness but never permanence. When Dudley's wife died under suspicious circumstances, Elizabeth withdrew. When Essex overstepped his authority, she destroyed him. Love, when it threatened control, became expendable. By the time Elizabeth reached old age, the emotional armor that had protected her for decades had become a prison. The court she once dominated now whispered behind her back. Younger nobles saw her as an obstacle rather than a leader. Foreign ambassadors described her as frail, temperamental, and increasingly isolated. She continued to wear elaborate gowns and wigs, not merely out of vanity, but to maintain the illusion of strength. To appear weak was to invite danger, even when danger no longer mattered. The deaths of her closest companions hollowed her world. With each loss, her past became heavier. She was surrounded by people who depended on her, but few who truly understood her. Sir Robert Cecil and other ministers managed affairs of state, but they could not ease the loneliness of a woman who had never allowed herself to be fully known. This emotional isolation magnified her fear of death. For Elizabeth, death was not a natural conclusion. It was annihilation, it was loss of control, it was silence after a lifetime of command. Unlike kings who passed authority to sons or brothers, Elizabeth faced oblivion. The Tudor dynasty would end not with a continuation, but with a void. Her identity, inseparable from her crown, had nowhere to go. Her refusal to name an heir for so long was not merely political strategy. It was denial. Naming a successor meant acknowledging that she would be replaced. It meant admitting that England could exist without her. Even as her body failed, she clung to the belief that holding power might delay death itself. This mindset explains the eerie scenes recorded during her final illness. When Elizabeth sat motionless for hours, it was not only physical weakness. It was resistance. When she refused food, she was asserting the only control left to her. When she refused to lie down, she was defying the ritual of dying. Her body was failing, but her will was still fighting. Witnesses noted that Elizabeth sometimes reacted angrily when urged to rest. She snapped at attendants. She turned her face away from physicians. She was not delusional. She was lucid enough to understand exactly what was happening, and that understanding terrified her. Unlike many rulers who accepted religious consolation, Elizabeth showed little comfort in prayer during her final days. Her faith, shaped by political necessity as much as conviction, offered limited solace. The fear that consumed her was not of divine judgment, but of erasure. Elizabeth had built her entire identity on presence, on command, on being seen and heard. Death meant invisibility. It meant becoming history rather than shaping it. And yet, even in this terror, Elizabeth remained Elizabeth. She maintained dignity when possible. She did not beg. She did not weep openly. Her suffering was internal, controlled, contained. The same discipline that had sustained her reign now prolonged her dying. When she finally gave her silent approval to James of Scotland, it was not an act of confidence. It was exhaustion. The struggle was over. The control she had wielded for nearly half a century was slipping beyond recovery. Her final days were terrifying because they stripped away every defense she had built. Power could not protect her. Intelligence could not outmaneuver death. Control could not halt time. Elizabeth, who had spent her life mastering fear, was finally forced to confront it without armor. In her death, England lost a queen. But in her dying, the world glimpsed the human cost of absolute power and lifelong vigilance. As Elizabeth's mind wrestled with fear and memory, her body was quietly collapsing under the weight of decades of strain. The physical reality of her final illness was as grim as the psychological torment that accompanied it, and together they created one of the most unsettling royal deaths in English history. What made her final days so frightening was not only her suffering, but the fragile balance of a kingdom that depended on her continued existence, even as that existence was clearly coming to an end. By early 1603, Elizabeth's health had been declining for months. Contemporary accounts describe swelling in her face and limbs, deep fatigue, and a general wasting of strength. She experienced recurring fevers, bouts of weakness, and difficulty moving without assistance. Her once commanding posture had stooped, and her hands, long used for expressive gestures, trembled when she attempted to lift them. While the precise medical cause of her death remains debated, historians and physicians have suggested several likely factors, including blood poisoning, pneumonia, cancer, or complications from severe dental infections that were common among the elite of her time. Elizabeth's famously poor teeth were more than a cosmetic issue. Years of consuming sugary preserves and sweets, combined with a lack of dental hygiene, had left her teeth decayed and blackened. Infections in the mouth could easily spread to the bloodstream, causing systemic illness. Chronic pain would also have contributed to her irritability, insomnia, and refusal to eat. Yet Elizabeth, deeply suspicious of physical vulnerability, rarely allowed physicians to examine her closely. Admitting pain was, in her mind, an admission of weakness. Her doctors, bound by the medical practices of the early 17th century, were largely powerless. Treatments relied on balancing bodily humors through purging, bleeding, and herbal remedies. These interventions often weakened patients rather than healed them. Elizabeth's refusal to submit to aggressive treatment may have been instinctive self-preservation. She had seen others hastened to death by doctors' hands. In her final illness, she accepted only minimal care, choosing to endure rather than surrender control. As her physical condition worsened, the atmosphere at court grew tense and fearful. The Queen's health was not merely a personal matter. It was a matter of national survival. England had experienced violent succession crises before, and the memory of the Wars of the Roses still haunted political thought. Without a clear and uncontested successor, the country risked rebellion, factional conflict, and foreign interference. Elizabeth's ministers were acutely aware of this danger. Sir Robert Cecil, the son of Elizabeth's great adviser William Cecil, had quietly opened communication with James VI of Scotland long before Elizabeth's death. These secret negotiations were acts of necessity, not betrayal. Cecil understood that stability required preparation, even if the Queen herself could not fully acknowledge the end approaching. The irony was sharp. While Elizabeth resisted the idea of her replacement, the machinery of state was already moving beyond her. Inside Richmond Palace, however, the focus remained on the Queen's failing body. Courtiers noted her prolonged silences and immobility. She would sit for hours without speaking, her eyes open but distant. Some interpreted this as depression. Others believed she was conserving energy. In truth, it was likely both. Movement exhausted her. Speech required effort she no longer possessed. Yet her refusal to lie down persisted, turning her final days into a grim vigil. This behavior disturbed those around her. In a culture where deathbed rituals were expected and respected, Elizabeth's resistance created unease. She denied her attendants the familiar structure of mourning preparation. There were no final blessings, no formal farewell speeches. The Queen seemed suspended between life and death, unwilling to cross fully into either state. This liminal existence added to the terror of the moment, as if the kingdom itself were trapped in uncertainty alongside her. Religious comfort, often central to early modern death, played a surprisingly limited role. Elizabeth had governed as the supreme governor of the Church of England, yet her personal faith was pragmatic rather than deeply emotional. While prayers were offered and clergy were present, there is little evidence that Elizabeth found peace in religious certainty. Her struggle was not with salvation, but with disappearance. She had been queen for nearly her entire adult life. Without the crown, who was she? As March progressed, Elizabeth's condition became impossible to conceal. On March 19, she officially entered a state of grave illness. Food was refused almost entirely. She took only small sips of liquid, and even those became infrequent. Her breathing grew shallow. Sleep came in brief, restless intervals, if at all. Courtiers described a sense of dread settling over the palace, broken only by whispers and the careful movements of servants. It was during this period that the succession question was finally forced into the open. Members of the Privy Council, knowing time was short, sought confirmation of Elizabeth's wishes. According to multiple accounts, when asked whom she desired as her successor, Elizabeth made a gesture indicating James of Scotland. Some reports claim she said that none but a king could follow her, implying James by elimination rather than enthusiasm. Whether spoken or gestured, the message was clear enough. The Tudor line would end and the Stuart line would begin. This moment, understated and subdued, was one of the most significant transfers of power in European history. There was no coronation, no declaration, no celebration. It occurred quietly, in the shadow of death, while Elizabeth sat too weak to speak. The Queen, who had mastered spectacle, allowed the greatest decision of her reign to pass almost unnoticed. This alone speaks to the depth of her exhaustion and resignation. By March 23, Elizabeth was nearing the end. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring words that witnesses struggled to understand. Some believed she spoke of past events or lost companions. Others thought her speech was purely delirium. What remains consistent is the description of her face, drawn and pale beneath layers of makeup that could no longer hide decay. The mask of the Virgin Queen was finally failing. The court waited. Messengers stood ready. Horses were prepared. Documents lay drafted, requiring only confirmation of death. England itself seemed to hold its breath. A single life, flickering in a darkened chamber, determined the fate of millions. In the early hours of March 24, 1603, Elizabeth's breathing slowed and then stopped. The moment was quiet, almost anticlimactic. No thunder, no proclamation, just the end of a presence that had defined an age. Yet the terror of her final days did not end with her last breath. The aftermath would reveal how deeply her reign had shaped England, and how fragile the transition truly was. Her death did not simply close a chapter. It exposed the cost of absolute rule, prolonged vigilance, and a lifetime spent outrunning fear. When Elizabeth I died in the early hours of March 24, 1603, England did not erupt into chaos. There was no immediate rebellion, no foreign invasion, no collapse of authority. On the surface, the transition of power appeared almost seamless. James VI of Scotland was proclaimed James I of England within hours. Courtiers donned black, bells tolled, official proclamations were read. The machinery of state continued to function, but this calm was deceptive. Beneath it lay decades of accumulated tension, unresolved contradictions, and a carefully constructed myth that would soon harden into legend. Elizabeth's terrifying final days mattered not because they disrupted the succession, but because they revealed the hidden cost of the world she had built and the psychological price of ruling through fear, vigilance, and absolute control. James's accession was smooth precisely because Elizabeth's ministers had prepared for it in secret. Sir Robert Cecil and other members of the Privy Council had quietly coordinated with Scottish officials to ensure continuity. This behind the scenes planning prevented a power vacuum, but it also underscored a painful truth. By the time Elizabeth died, her personal authority was no longer essential to the functioning of the state. The system she had shaped had learned how to move on without her. This realization casts her final terror in a harsher light. Elizabeth had resisted naming an heir for decades out of fear that it would weaken her rule. Yet in the end, the succession occurred with minimal disruption, suggesting that her control, while immense, was not as indispensable as she believed. The very thing she feared most, replacement, happened quietly and efficiently. Her struggle against death had been personal, not political. Elizabeth's funeral, held on April 28, 1603, was a carefully choreographed display of national mourning. Her coffin, covered in purple velvet and adorned with a lifelike effigy, was carried through London streets lined with silent crowds. Chroniclers noted genuine grief among the people. Elizabeth had been a constant presence for nearly half a century. Most living English subjects had known no other ruler. Her death marked the end of a familiar world. Yet even in death, the true nature of her final days was concealed. The public image presented was one of dignified decline, a wise queen passing peacefully into history. The prolonged suffering, the refusal to lie down, the silence, the fear were omitted. This was deliberate. Monarchies survive on narrative as much as authority. To reveal the vulnerability of the crown would have undermined the stability of the new reign. Thus began the transformation of Elizabeth from human ruler into near-mythic figure. Over time, her image hardened into that of the Virgin Queen, eternally composed, eternally in control. Painters softened her features. Writers emphasized her triumphs. The terror of her final days was replaced by the idea of serene fulfillment. This myth served England well. It provided continuity and pride at a moment of dynastic change. But it came at the cost of truth. The consequences of Elizabeth's reign extended far beyond the question of succession. Under her rule, England had stabilized religiously, but at the price of intolerance. Catholics were marginalized, surveilled, and punished. Protestants who dissented from official doctrine also faced suppression. Elizabeth's religious settlement was pragmatic, not pluralistic. It preserved order, but it did so through control rather than reconciliation. This legacy would resurface under the Stuart kings, contributing to tensions that eventually erupted into civil war later in the century. Internationally, Elizabeth's policies reshaped England's global role. Her resistance to Spanish dominance and her support for privateers laid the groundwork for England's emergence as a naval power. Yet these achievements were fueled by constant conflict and financial strain. The wars of her later reign drained resources and left unresolved problems for her successor. James inherited a kingdom at peace, but financially fragile and politically divided beneath the surface. Elizabeth's personal choices also shaped the future in quieter ways. By refusing to marry and produce an heir, she ended the Tudor dynasty. While James's accession united the English and Scottish crowns, it also introduced a ruler unfamiliar with English political culture. James believed deeply in the divine right of kings, a philosophy that clashed with the political realities Elizabeth had carefully managed. Where she had balanced factions, James often provoked them. Where she had concealed weakness, he exposed it. The stability Elizabeth preserved through fear and performance would not survive unchanged. Understanding Elizabeth's terrifying end forces a re-evaluation of her greatness. She was not simply a triumphant monarch who died content. She was a ruler who survived through relentless self-control, emotional restraint, and constant vigilance. These qualities made her formidable, but they also isolated her. By the time death approached, she had few true equals, fewer confidants, and no family to carry her memory forward personally. The crown was her identity, and when it slipped away, there was nothing beneath it to soften the fall. Her final refusal to lie down remains one of the most haunting symbols of her life. It encapsulates her entire reign. Elizabeth stood when others fell. She remained upright under pressure. She refused surrender. Even at the edge of death, she resisted the posture of defeat. This was not dignity in the conventional sense. It was defiance, and it was terrifying because it revealed how deeply she equated control with existence itself. For historians, Elizabeth's end offers a rare glimpse behind the carefully maintained facade of monarchy. It reminds us that even the most powerful rulers are shaped by fear, trauma, and memory. Elizabeth's terror was not weakness. It was the inevitable consequence of a life spent outrunning vulnerability. Her strength had always depended on never allowing herself to appear fragile. Death stripped that illusion away. Why does this matter today? Because Elizabeth's reign is often used as a model of strong leadership, national unity, and personal sacrifice. Her final days complicate that narrative. They show that strength built entirely on control carries a hidden cost. When authority becomes identity, its loss becomes annihilation. Elizabeth's terror was not simply fear of dying, it was fear of ceasing to be. In the centuries since her death, Elizabeth I has been celebrated as one of England's greatest monarchs. That reputation is not undeserved. She preserved her kingdom through extraordinary challenges. She shaped a national identity that endured. But acknowledging the terror of her final days does not diminish her legacy. It deepens it. It restores her humanity. Elizabeth Tudor was not a marble statue or a painted icon. She was a woman forged by danger, sustained by intellect, and undone by the very vigilance that made her powerful. Her final days were terrifying because they revealed the truth beneath the crown. And that truth, once seen, cannot be unseen.